Hi everybody, let's debrief this mastery level problem. The goal here is to have you practice the kind of thinking that you need to be able to make sense of new situations. So if this is a graph of f of x, I'm curious what the graph of 1 divided by f of x looks like. So I can start thinking about this by thinking about particular values in this graph and what's going to happen if I plug in those same x values in the reciprocal function here. So let's just start at x equals 0. At x equals 0, f of x is negative 1. So what happens in my new graph at x equals 0? I'll have 1 divided by negative 1. And so that point remains unchanged. I've still got a point at negative 1. All right, at x equals 1, we have an asymptote here, which means that f of 1 isn't defined. So that also means that I won't have a point directly at x equals 1 on the new graph either. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I have an asymptote. So instead, let's ask what happens to the 1 over f graph as x gets closer and closer and closer to the asymptote. So it seems like what's happening here, let's imagine x getting closer and closer and closer to 1. Okay, so let's say I've got like 0.9, 0.99, 0.999. So we don't have exact y values here. But what I can see is that as the x values get closer to 1, the y values are going towards negative infinity. So we might imagine at 0.9, maybe we've got, I don't know, negative 5. And then at 0.99, it's quite a bit more negative, maybe negative 999. And then even closer to 1, maybe it's even more negative, something like this. Okay, so let's now imagine, sorry, the lights went off. Let's now imagine what would happen if we take those f of x values and we divide 1 by those values. So here, 1 over f of x. All right, so when x is 0.9, we'll have like negative 1/5. When x is 0.99, we'll have negative 1 over 999. Here we'll have negative 1 over 9999. What I'm noticing is these are all negative, but they're getting closer and closer to 0. So what I have is as x is approaching 1, y is approaching 0. So if I was going to start plotting these points, I don't know if it's linear or not linear, but I'm getting closer and closer and closer to 0. And then when x equals 1, remember, f of 1 is not defined, which means 1 over f of x is also not defined. So I think I've got a curve that's approaching 1, but then there's a hole right there, not an asymptote. You can think about it in a similar way from the other side. If I have x values that are getting close to 1 from the positive side, so let's say like 1.1, 1.01, 1.001, I could imagine a similar thing happening. Maybe at 1.1, I have a value of 5, and then like 1,000, and then like 10,000. So what you're imagining is as x gets closer, y gets larger and larger and larger. And so in that case, 1 over f is going to be positive. I'll have 1/5, 1 1,000th, 1 10,000th. And again, as x is getting closer to 1 from this side, so x goes from 1.1 to 0.1 to 0.001, the y values are also getting smaller and smaller towards 0. So on this side, I can imagine x values getting closer and closer and closer, and y values getting closer and closer to 0. So I really think around this asymptote, the reciprocal function just has a hole there. Okay, by the time we get to 2, let's see, f of 2 is 1. So that means 1 over 1 is 1. So we still have another point that is unchanged. So these 2 points are the same on both graphs. Okay, what about 3? So f of 3 is 0. I know that 1 divided by 0 would be undefined. This is very similar to the sine function in the other set of answers. So as x gets closer and closer to 3, the y values get smaller and smaller towards 0. If I'm dividing by numbers that get closer and closer to 0, that means that the output is getting larger and larger towards infinity. So here, I'm going to have a vertical asymptote. And because all the y values here are positive, I know 1 divided by a positive number is positive. And so that's why I'm going up. On the other side here, all the y values are negative, so I'll be dividing 1 by a negative number, so the curve will be on the negative side. And by the same reasoning, as I'm getting closer to an x value of 3, the f of x values approach 0, which means I'm dividing by numbers that get close to 0, which means my outputs are approaching negative infinity from that side. And then at 4, again, I have a point at negative 1, which would appear right here. So I think this is a pretty good sketch of what 1 over f of x should look like. Remember, your thinking skills are you have to be able to imagine not what happens when you plug in a number at a particular point, but what's happening as your values are approaching that number. You don't really need to make a table unless you feel like it would help you. Because all I'm doing in my mind is I'm thinking, the outputs are getting larger and larger and larger negative. If I divide by something that gets bigger and bigger, I know that my whole fraction gets smaller and smaller towards 0. So I'm able to kind of imagine the whole thing in my mind. But maybe it's only because I've had a lot of experiences like this where I actually think it through one step at a time. Okay, I hope that this was helpful. Once again, try the homework. There is a follow-up problem to this one that tests the same kind of skills. Good luck.